Oh, hello, come over. Come and join me. How are you? Find me outdoors in the gardens. We're so close to Midsummer Day, and come out and enjoy the evening light. And then the Temple of Peace here. I'm having a nice little, some aromatic black cherry tobacco in a little Peterson. But luckily you find me with a book, in fact. And it's a book I always like to get out about this time of year. It's a rather lovely illustrated edition of Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, a play that one should always reread sometime around midsummer, magical time. And you can see from this that it's one of those classic Edwardian illustrated Shakespeares, of which there were so many. I mean, there was quite a vogue for them, these beautifully produced. Look at the lovely covering there and the spine. And there are people like Edmund Dulac did them, and of course Arthur Rackham famously did them, and there were a number of other great illustrators. But this one, interestingly, it's a first edition of this particular illustrator, obviously not of the Shakespeare. It's 1914, just the end of that glorious kind of golden summer before quite almost literally all hell was let loose. Normally I wouldn't be able to afford a book like this, because they're rather collector's pieces, particularly in the first edition. These very beautiful colour illustrations with they had that lovely thing, didn't they? We've got an Arthur Rackham with of the ring cycle like this, with all the lovely sort of tracing paper to preserve the colour and the texture of this beautiful, and you see these little fairies and cherubs and but I was able to afford this, and you'll see why if you just look at the frontispiece here, that somebody has had a go at colouring in parts of the black and white illustrations here. They've used it as a colouring book. I think it may have been a young person, quite a careful young person, but from the collector's point of view, that's spoilt it. Though actually I think it's rather nice, and it's quite playful, but it suddenly makes it affordable. And in fact it was in a charity shop. It was in Oxfam, and I got it for £25. But the illustrator is neither Dulac nor Rackham, but interestingly Heath Robinson. There you are, illustrated by W. Heath Robinson. Well, Heath Robinson is very famous for the wonderful whimsical cartoons of elaborate contraptions and illustrating the Professor Brainstorm things, and extraordinary machines for doing simple tasks, like stirring tea or buttering scones. But there'd be a magnificent series of cause and effect, ramshackle things going all the way around until the final effect of buttering the toast or whatever it was achieved. I think an inspiration later for Wallace and Gromit. But it's less. He did those in the First World War, and it's less well known that before that he was an illustrator of these rather luxurious books. And look, there's a little, it's all set in Athens, of course, the play, so he's got these very classical things here, and then he's got the little faun playing there. It's a very beautiful thing, and it's lovely paper. And I love to read the play around this time of year. There's somebody else having a go at the illustrations and colouring them there. I think that's quite charming. But it suddenly made the book affordable. So I'm fond of this book for lots of reasons. I'm fond of this play for lots of reasons. One is that I was in it once. It was the first sort of proper big school production. In fact, it was a joint production between our school and our sister school, the girls' school. So there were extra motivations for us as sixth formers, as teenage boys, to be interested in drama, because it was the only thing you were allowed to do with the girls. So I was in it, and I was Puck, and I delighted in it and the whole play. So I learnt it almost by heart, the whole play, not just my part, just by being at all the rehearsals. But later on, I came to find that there were passages in this play that began to mean as much to me beyond the bounds of the magical play as they did within it. And there's a particular passage about poetry which comes, let's see if we can find it, here we are, yeah. This is the beginning of Act 5. And it's when the Duke Theseus and Hippolyta, his Amazon queen, it's announced at the beginning of the play they're going to get married. But meantime, there's all the other two pairs of lovers who get mismatched and lost in the woods and lose and find each other and eventually come back all sorted out. But having been through all these magical transformations with Puck and Oberon and Titania. And all this has happened without Hippolyta and Theseus being around. So this act begins that they've just been told about it and they're wondering whether to believe it. And Hippolyta says, you know, "'Tis strange, my Theseus, that these lovers speak of." And Theseus, who's a very sort of bluff, blunt, practical sort of chap, so he believes, says, "Oh, more strange than true, I never may believe these antique fables nor these fairy toys." Which is quite funny because, of course, he is literally an antique fable. That's what he is. He's Duke Theseus. He's just won a war against the Amazon queens. You know, he's a figure of legend. And he goes on to say why he doesn't believe lunatics or lovers or poets. But and he tries to dismiss it. But the more he dismisses it, the more he makes the case for it. And Shakespeare has quite a lot of fun with that. He starts off by saying things, you know, "Oh, they've got shaping fantasies, they apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends," which is quite interesting, thinking about how you know you apprehend some things, you comprehend others. Can you move from the one to the other? And then, having dismissed the lunatic and the lover, he gives a description of the poet, which I think is Shakespeare's own signature description, as it were, of what he thinks poetry is. You'll know it, but and I know it too, but it's just lovely sat out on this page. "The poet's eye, in a fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes, and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name." I just think that is the most perfect description of poetry. I love the fact that the poet can see everything, earth and heaven, heaven and earth. The glance goes from one to the other. And I love the fact that the imagination isn't about some made-up airy-fairy world, even though this book is full of fairies. But they're all bodied forth. You can see them. They're described wonderfully. And of course, they're literally bodied forth by the bodies of actors playing it, because Shakespeare's true medium is not the book, however beautifully produced in the golden age of Edwardian illustration. His real medium is flesh and blood. And the way he says, "Imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name," that's so true of what the best poetry does. But years after I reflected that on poetry, I came, having come to faith myself, to write a book called Faith, Hope and Poetry, in which I tried to think about theology and poetry in the same breath. And I suddenly came to realise that this passage in Shakespeare was actually playing on the beginnings of John's Gospel, where you have, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the same was in the beginning with God. And it's glorious stuff, but it's going on around like that up in the air. And then suddenly in verse 14 you get, "And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. We beheld his glory, full of glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." And the whole story in John's Gospel is about how God bodies forth in Jesus everything we need to know about who he is and what heaven is like and what love is, and all of those things that are just there. And you can see them. And the very first question in John's Gospel of the disciples is, "Where are you staying?" In fact, in Latin, it's "Magister ubi habitat." Where is your habitation? And here's Shakespeare saying, "Gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name." And I came to see that there's a very strong parallel between our small creative acts as poets, trying to body something forth, and this profound full bodying forth of everything in Christ. And of course the play is set in Athens. It's supposed to be BC, but if it's full of Christian reference, and it's a wonderful thinking through of what the gospel is, but in other terms, rather as C.S. Lewis would later do when he invented Narnia. And he doesn't name Jesus anywhere, but it's full of these kind of gospel truths, and I get great pleasure. I mean, it's great fun, the play. It's full of playfulness and mischief, as I know only too well, having been Puck, who's the real centre of most of the mischief, who's typecasting, you know. But I now see, along with the fun and the wonderful flights of fancy, there's a profound imaginative bodying forth of eternal truths in this play. So it's always fun to look at it. And oh look, there's a lovely, we'll just finish showing you. I just picked these illustrations at random. Isn't that a beautiful, peaceful image, the temple reflected in the water there. Really lovely, decorous stuff. So, a pleasure to touch and handle, and you know, you couldn't get a meal and a couple of drinks in a decent pub for the price I paid for this book, and the meals are long gone, but the book remains forever, and I can pass it on to my children, so it's wins all round. Anyway, thanks for dropping round. Sarchi.